Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, Iran has had its parliamentary elections just yesterday, and these were important elections because they come at a time when the international community has placed significant amounts of pressure on Iran, and speaking specifically, of course, of the United States, ever since its initial decision to walk away from the nuclear deal, and that we've had the maximum pressure campaign enacted against Iran. There have also been sanctions placed on 5 members of the Guardian Council of Iran, which is responsible or was responsible for vetting candidates who could take part in those parliamentary elections to begin with. And then there is the Financial Action Task Force, which has hit the country with even further sanctions, meaning that at this point in time, there'll be even less companies around the world. They'll be willing to do business in Iran, and that will be even more of a hit to its economy, an economy that's already been suffering from severe sanctions placed back by the United States. There's also then pressure on the Trump administration to snap back, to use the snapback mechanism fully, as envisioned within the nuclear deal, as you'd remember, to prevent the expiration of the UN arms embargo, which has been placed on Iran that in fact expires, I should say, this October. So there's a lot to discuss there as far as the foreign angle on all this and how that then affects the domestic political scene as well. Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Hadi Gholami, who is a political analyst. He's joining us from the Iranian capital, Tehran. We're also joined by Yousof Azizi, who is a researcher and analyst at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs. He was working on U.S. foreign policy decision-making and Iran's nuclear program. He's joining us now from Arlington, Virginia. Yousof and Hadi, thank you both for your time today. Hadi, let me start with you. Tell us the mood in the country in the lead up to these parliamentary elections and after. There are estimates that voter turnout was around 40% throughout the country. That's not an exceedingly high number.
Sure. Looking from the domestic side here, many people, partly the people that affiliate themselves with the reformists in Iran, haven't been very happy lately with how the current administration and the parliament has been acting the last few years, and also the increasing pressure on the populace because of the sanctions, and also part because of the inability of the government to apply some very necessary fixes to the economy and stop the corruption, or at least decrease that. Many people just, as the turnout is showing right now, many people didn't actually even bother to go there and vote. Last time, I think, it was around 60%. And now it's the unofficial record say like 40%. And many people just have kind of given up on the parliament to be able to fix anything, at least from the reformist side. And the people I have been seeing and the mood that they have been having lately. Also, there is both foreign factors and internal factors are affecting this elections, but many people have.
Right. Let me bring in Yousof. Yousof, tell us about what your thoughts are about how the foreign pressure on is affecting the country, because it seems that ever since Donald Trump had made that decision, right, even as candidate, that he didn't like the Iran nuclear deal, and since he walked away from it officially, it seems to be one thing after another which seems to be hitting Iran, be it its economy or be it its international image as well.
So thank you for having me in the show. I would like to talk that, yes, President Trump, from the beginning, from his campaigning in 2016, he disagreed with Iran nuclear deal, and he said that United States soon withdrew from the deal. In the other hand, in Iranian sector, the President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, they really want to stay in JCPOA without any action, but under the pressure, because there is no benefit under JCPOA until last year. Iran will continue to do its obligation under the JCPOA, but the United States and European countries, even China and Russia, they refuse to do their promises. So Iranians tried to, about 10 months ago, try to step back from the JCPOA, their obligation, every 60 days. And now they step back in five levels. And now we can see that anything is complicated. The Europeans looking at the November election, 2020 election, president election in the United States. Iranian Prime Minister Javad Zarif and President Rouhani also waiting for the result of that election. But during this time, until the November, there are many, during these 10 months, there are many mechanisms and events may happen that Iranians shouldn't waste time until that. They should, as they started, they have to reimpose and renew their nuclear facility, nuclear arrangement and nuclear activity to the level of the before of JCPOA or even higher for the next level of negotiation.
Okay, so Hadi, tell us, do you think that the domestic politics and domestic scene is such that it will even allow for further negotiations with the U.S.? Is that what the Iranian people really want, do you think?
I'm not going to be able to answer that to be sure and be a 100% certainty, but let's remember that the Iranian government actually tried to negotiate and negotiated once, and they unilaterally just abandoned the deal. And the situation right now is mostly because of the decision of the Trump administration to suddenly withdraw from the deal, and it doesn't seem to me that the populace would actually trust the U.S. for another round of negotiations. But there is another thing: if there is enough pressure, maybe, if the economic conditions gets much worse, maybe there would be more acceptance among the people because of a hope that maybe that would decrease the economic pressure.
All right, we're quickly running out of time. So, Yousof, I'll give you the final word before I let you both go. Tell us, do you think that the window of opportunity for negotiations with the Iranian government is closing very fast? And I'm talking about specifically with the U.S. because, if we're going to have people now in Parliament who are possibly more conservative than the Rouhani party, I mean, if we call them reformists or whatever we want to name them, but they'd be more willing to discuss with the U.S. certainly. So if we're going to have a change in the political landscape in Iran, that's not a good thing on the part of the U.S., right? I mean, for the U.S. I mean, do you think the U.S. should be taking advantage now, before it's too late, to actually negotiate in any way?
So yes, that's a good question. If we look back at 2002 to 2003, when Iran and European Troika, England, France, and Germany, they reached the agreement on Iranian nuclear issues. But at that time, with the disapproval of the United States, that time also there is a similar cycle like this happened. The seventh Majlis, the Parliament. Election in Iran happened, and it affected the next president. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad came to the office in 2005 after a so-called reformist president, Mohammad Khatami. And at that time, Iranian tried. There is a cycle of sanctions by West, and there is progress in Iranian nuclear activity and military activity at that time for 8 years. And after that, there is a time that Obama came to the office, Rouhani came to the office in 2013, when Rouhani came to the office. And before that, the separate negotiation in Amman happened, that the United States accept the red line of Iran, which is enrichment of uranium in the soil of Iran. Yeah. So we can see that Iranians reached to the level of uranium enrichment and uranium activity, nuclear activity, that the United States, try to manage it happening. So my argument is that during the first term of President Trump, no, it is unlikely that we can see any progress in negotiation. But maybe in the second term, if President Trump again elected, that it is likely in the United States or even a Democrat, we may see that Trump, dismiss some of his radical advisors and minister and secretaries like Pompeo, as we had done to John Bolton. And it is a signal to Iran that we are ready to negotiate, to, sit in the table and negotiate at the same level to each other.
Very well. There's a final thought, but we appreciate both Yousof and Hadi for speaking to us and for sharing their thoughts with us. The Iranian parliamentary elections, as I said, did occur yesterday. Turnout hasn't been as high as the previous round, where, as Hadi there correctly mentioned, was around 60%. This time, it's been approximately 40% turnout throughout the country. I'm saying around 30%, according to some estimates, or 25% in Tehran, depending on whose estimates you believe. But certainly, there has been an effect domestically on the political landscape because of the decision, as Hadi also had said, of Donald Trump to walk away from the nuclear deal. There's been an effect then obviously on the desire of Iranians to want to even negotiate further with the United States. Remember that the nuclear deal was a hard-fought deal. It wasn't like it came up overnight. It was hard-fought. These were very tough negotiations that took many, many years. Both reformist and conservative administrations within the U.S. and Iran both negotiated that deal. So those effects still very much remain. And now we have FATF sanctions being placed on Iran as well at this time. And on top of that, the sanctions on the Guardian Council. So this is seemingly a domino effect on the country. Will it bow? Will it come to the negotiating table? That's something that we're going to wait and see. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still watching Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the EU budget. There is a gaping hole of $81 billion, approximately 75 billion euros left because of Brexit and the UK walking away from the EU bloc. It seems that EU members are now having a hard time filling that gap and agreeing on how exactly that gap will be filled, as well as, of course, coming to terms with the other costs, the increasing costs for the bloc, such as that for climate change or otherwise. Is this as simple as just Brexiteers getting it right this time, that the EU really was eating up too much of UK resources? Were they right all along? And, the narrative from the EU side has always been that the UK was getting major advantages by being in the EU, but was it really the other way around in many ways? Let me put that now to our panelists who are joining us. We're joined by Iain Begg, who is a professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. He's joining us now from London. Joining us from Vienna is Marcus Howe, who is the head of research and analysis at Vienna East Consulting. Marcus and Iain, thank you both for your time today. Marcus, let me start with you. What do you put down for this disagreement right now between all of these EU members? There's a lot of talk about, that gaping hole of $81 billion. And secondly, there's also talk about rich versus poor members.
Yes, well, I think that there are numerous aspects to it. I mean, the first of which is that this is clearly a significant funding shortfall. I mean, I think it accounts for 7 to 8% of the envisaged €1 trillion EU budget for the next 7 years. So there's a lot of ground to make up. The Polish Prime Minister presciently described the negotiations as the most difficult in the history of EU budgets. And as a result of this, we have, in particular, this faction that has formed, known as the Frugal Four, namely Austria, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Yeah. And their feeling is very much that they don't want to increase their spending contributions by any significant amount, precisely for the reason that they feel that they showed sufficient solidarity over the previous 7-year budget cycle. And they, member states, have not shown that same good faith. So we have the southern member states, for instance, who were hit hard by the economic crisis and want to increase public spending, but in many cases, to violate EU fiscal rules. And then of course, you don't only have the north-south divide, you also have the west-east, which involves the eastern.
I'm just going to break into that, Marcus, just because I want to go to Iain with that very question as well, Iain, about what you think exactly this is down to. Do you think that at some level Brexiteers may be feeling a bit smug about the fact that the EU is having a hard time coming to terms with life after the UK leaving?
Well, there's undoubtedly going to be some gloating going on among Brexiteers, seeing the EU in difficulty. But I'm a veteran of this. This is, I think, the 5th 7-year cycle that I've been a commentator on. I'm very familiar with the whole debate. It's important to try to put it in perspective, because the EU budget in aggregate is around 1 percentage point of EU gross national income, or GDP, to put it in more familiar terms. Now, that compares with the typical federal budget in European countries, or indeed in the US, of an excess of 20%. So in practice, we're talking about a relatively small amount of money, even though the headline total looks big. What's going on with this is that there's a three-way fight going on. The Frugal Four and the other net contributors, who include Germany, are anxious not to increase the amount of spending to compensate for the UK's departure. But you also find a number of countries, the majority of the member states of the European Union, saying we need to keep spending on the things we traditionally spent money on, regional development and agriculture, while also responding to the demands from citizens for more spending on things like climate change, dealing with the migration challenges, external borders, and so on. Now, these are three demands. You can only have two of them at any time. It's what some of my academic colleagues call a trilemma. You can only get 2 out of 3 at any time.
Makes sense. All right, so let me go to you, Marcus. Do you think that when I mentioned to you as well the rich versus poor members and that divide and gap that exists within the European bloc, how important, let me put it this way, how important is that? Because many would argue, or some would argue, I should say, that even by being in the EU doesn't necessarily mean that you will become that much richer as a member.
Well, I think the very important thing to bear in mind is that although the Frugal Four, for instance, are making a lot of noise about their budget contributions and the fact that they don't want to increase them, they benefit disproportionately from membership of the single market. I think between the 4 states, they respectively generate about 3 to 5 billion euros per year in benefit from their membership of the single market, which is far more than what they pay in budget contributions, to which a rebate also applies. So I think it's very important to bear in mind that also the southern member states, and indeed the eastern ones, don't reap those same benefits of the membership of the single market. So in that sense, I think that the dichotomy of the importance of the budget contributions sort of versus, sort of wealthy versus poor states just doesn't really make very much sense when you take the bigger picture.
So, when I'm talking poor members, Iain, I'm talking about the likes of Hungary, for example, or Romania, or even Poland and others. Do you think that they've really benefited by being members of the EU? I mean, we know Viktor Orban, for example, has his major disagreements with Brussels.
Well, we look at the numbers. Poland, Hungary, and a number of the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe have benefited far more from being associated with the EU than many of the southern European countries like Greece, Italy, or Portugal. You see this in the GDP figures. There's been spectacular growth in Poland, strong growth in Hungary, and that is in part attributable to the membership of the single market, because it has led to foreign direct investment going into those countries. It's partly also that there have been transfers from the EU budget, which in the case of the highest levels can reach 4 to 5 percentage points of GDP. So it's significant. I think Orban will say a lot about how he dislikes some things the EU is insisting on, but he's never going to compromise the net transfers he's getting from it.
Marcus, right now, even at the unemployment numbers across the EU, and it's about 6.3% according to an October 2019 estimate. That's significant, isn't it? Do you think the EU, for example, has done enough to address jobs, for example, across the bloc? Because that's also been a huge sort of source of criticism, hasn't it, for the bloc?
Yes, well, I think that is, one of many major strategic issues that the EU seems to be demonstrating itself incapable of really properly addressing. So there's, quibbling over, percentile rates of what more to contribute to the budget, but there are these great structural issues such as unemployment, such as geopolitical issues, also to do with defence, research development, environmental policy, and so on, where the EU just isn't really stepping up to the plate. It isn't really prepared to the funding to finance these reforms, and reform is expensive, and there seems to be very little political will in that respect.
Iain, I'll get the final before letting you both go. What are your thoughts about unemployment across the bloc?
Well, you have to look at it with some care. Some countries in the EU are very close to full employment. Germany is a good example. The Nordic countries are close to full employment. The problem is predominantly in the south of Europe and in France. Now, the French government, in relation to the budget, has shown a willingness to expand spending, but it also says do not cut the subsidies coming to our farmers. So this is another example of the kinds of tricky political decisions that have to be taken. One of the ironies of this whole debate about the EU budget is, I've mentioned before, that it being 1% of overall GDP, the fraction that is being argued about is about 1/10 of a percentage point or 2/10 of a percentage point of GDP. So in overall terms, it's really peanuts that they're arguing about. It's just that every finance minister wants to come home saying, I won.
Indeed, that seems to be the word that finance ministers want, that those bragging rights. I'll leave it there with Iain and Marcus for now. We, of course, appreciate their time and, of course, their insight on this important topic. We'll be back with two other panelists to continue this discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back, viewers. We're continuing the discussion about the EU budget and the gaping hole of, as I said in my introduction earlier, $81 billion left by Brexit and how much that may really be affecting the EU budget going forward. Let's continue that discussion now. We're joined by Gunter Walzenbach, who is a senior lecturer in European politics at the University of the West of England. He's joining us now from Bristol. And joining us from Dubai is Justin Gibbins, who is assistant professor at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Zayed University. His research interests include British politics, European affairs, as well as U.S. relations. Justin and Gunter, thank you both for your time today. Gunter, let me start with you. Do you think that a lot of Brexiteers are probably feeling quite smug because the EU is probably having a bit of a hard time filling the vacuum that they've left behind?
I don't necessarily think so, actually. I think it is a bit exaggerated, the consequence of the British budget contribution. In fact, in the past, there has always been a lot of disagreement because of the British rebate and the various difficulties that the UK had with its contributions, and also the question how much they would get in return for making those contributions. So a lot of that kind of constant discussion and at times aggravation is falling away. And obviously a lot will still depend on the precise settlement that is supposed to occur over this year or so with regards to the precise relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. So, for example, if the United Kingdom still wants to have access to the single market, it is not unthinkable that they would still have to make also a contribution to the EU budget. So I think, the figures that are floating around might also be exaggerated because of the settlement in the context of the Brexit negotiations. So for that reason, I think there are a few other problems that make budget negotiations difficult. And it is not just the British Brexit that does complicate the negotiations, but that in many ways I would in fact argue is business as usual for the European Union when it comes to these multi-annual frameworks that are supposed to set out the broad parameters of the budget over the next 7 years or so. But that really has always been a quite complicated process.
Indeed. Justin, I wonder what your thoughts on that, because, at the very least, Brexiteers would argue, listen, this is the sort of thing that we've been trying to get out of, where our country would need to contribute whatever amount it contributed to the EU bloc and not get as much in return. And, we would be regulated heavily, et cetera, that all of that is negative. Do you think that that's the way some member states may still be feeling, for example, Hungary?
Certainly. certainly. Just perhaps going back to what Richard was mentioning. Certainly, I still think that obviously from perhaps a British perspective that is supportive of Brexit, that these situations and these contestations and disagreements might seem, on paper to be, example of why perhaps Britain left. But I absolutely agree with your speaker that these things are nothing new, and there are disagreements within EU institutions themselves, such as the Commission requiring governments members to kind of provide 1.1% of GNI for the EU, whereas the Parliament demanding more, 1.3%. There are divisions between kind of agricultural countries, France, Spain, Poland, for example, which rely more on subsidies than those economies that don't perhaps rely so much on that sector. So in a way, it's yes, okay. You might say that some of the acrimony or some of the disagreements may well have been galvanized by the British desire to leave and the need to kind of plug that 75 billion euro hole. But these are contestations and disagreements that have been going on for a very long time, and it is a business as usual issue in relation to trying to get agreement now, not between 28 countries but 27. It's not that much different, really.
Okay, so then let's discuss then just the EU bloc itself then, Gunter, right now as it stands. Charles Michel, the former Prime Minister of Belgium, has come under a lot of criticism for the budget that was proposed by him, at least, that he was aiming too high. And there's a lot of challenges that the bloc faces, right? And we could talk about climate change. That would cost money, and fighting climate change, of course. Unemployment is still at 6.3%, at least as of October 2019 estimates. And there are a lot of other challenges, certainly financial challenges that the bloc faces as well. Is the EU as an institution aiming just too high?
Well, there are different views on that. Obviously, I think it is natural that in the political setup of the whole system, actors that try to represent, for example, the views of the Commission or of the European Council or of the European Parliament will disagree because they have to serve, to some extent, different interests. But it's the beauty of the mechanisms that at the end of the day, they all have to come together. Obviously there are different interests, different stakes, different concerns about the budget. At the end of the day, they all have to be settled. It is in that sense not different to what goes on in domestic political systems that try to identify the best way to spend limited resources. And within the Union, there has always been that division between the so-called net contributors and those who receive more out of the budget because they have particular development needs or because they are relatively new members to the European Union.
And what are your thoughts about that, Gunter? Because that's a good point. I'm glad you brought up, because a lot of those countries, the ones who contribute more and and the ones that are poorer than and possibly gain more by being in the EU, there is then that disagreement, right, where the richer are saying, listen, we don't want to just keep doling out money. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, that kind of constellation has been around for a long time. And it has always been possible to come eventually to a settlement. But of course, the precise nature of that settlement will depend on what the policy program of the new Commission will be for the next 6 to 7 years. And as you mentioned, there are new priorities with regards to the environment. There are new priorities with regards to, for example, youth unemployment or with regards to the digital economy. And therefore, adjustments will have to be made. Naturally, the European Parliament is eager to increase resources. Naturally, those countries which are net contributors will try to limit. Of course, there has always been the argument, in addition, and on top of that money is not everything. The major power of the Union comes out of its regulatory activity. So the budget debate as a conflict, I think, is vastly exaggerated, typically in the media. I think it is really for the people involved in this as a kind of business as usual. There are new priorities. They have to be accommodated. And that is obviously a process of intense negotiations over extended period of time, because there are so many different stakeholders, and they all want to see to some extent their concerns accommodated. And, that takes time, but I wouldn't say that is something anywhere close to a crisis.
Okay, Justin, what are your thoughts on that? Do you agree with Gunter? This is not really that much of a crisis? Because I don't know. I mean, I don't have an opinion either way. But when we're looking at the situation of countries that are richer within the EU, the richer member states, their argument about, okay, we can't just keep handing out money. I mean, in their point of view, I'm paraphrasing, of course, to the poorer member states, and I'm talking about the likes of Romania, Hungary, possibly Poland, and others, who are the bottom of the ladder financially. Is that a fair argument? Does the bloc need to come to some sort of an understanding where, okay, we have to lift up these poor member states in some other way?
I think the disagreement's really it's pretty much like your question to Richard. I mean, is it aiming too high? And in a sense it is, because it just cannot achieve all of the goals that it wants to achieve. The Finnish PM at the Brussels meeting, Sanna Marin, actually urged EU leaders just to be practical about it. He's shifting away from perhaps some of the idealism that still seems to be attached to the European Union in its status, that it has a number of priorities. The priorities are constantly shifting, but one cannot meet all of them at the same time, be it cohesion, environment, the money that they wish to have demarcated for innovation and digital media, neighbourhood funding aspiring EU members, and migration and so forth. So I think where Brexit slightly comes into this, and I think this is the level of caution that you do see from some EU leaders, is that there is some fear of instability. You don't just see it from Brexit, a leading member leaving. You also see it in the economies of some of the countries where you've seen a downturn in 2019, not catastrophically so, but nonetheless a kind of slight decrease in the wealth attached in the growth rates in many European countries, including the frugal four, Austria, Denmark, and Sweden and whatnot. So it just tends to be the case. I mean, I think historically that when countries feel that they are benefiting from the EU, when they're economically doing better, they will tend to kind of be more willing to kind of commit resources. When there's a level of instability, which has been caused most noticeably by Brexit, and when the national economies of some countries is not doing so well, then I think you do get this desire to kind of slightly kind of put the brakes on and to try to deal with issues practically and not kind of expand on resources. I think states become a little bit more sovereign, a little bit more nation state-like when they feel that there's instability in the international system.
Gunter, it was Macron who said that we don't need Britain to show the disunity within the EU. I guess I'm paraphrasing a bit of what he said there, but I believe that was a similar quote that he had said when it came to this budget meeting that occurred and the disagreements that were brought up there. Do you think that then this is a good bloc to then have more member states added to? Because as you know, I believe there are two countries who want to join the EU at this time. I believe North Macedonia and one other whose name escapes me right now. Do you think it's time for this bloc to take on even more members? I mean, shouldn't they be resolving their issues that disunite them or divide them, be it budgetary or ideological or otherwise?
Well, coming back to my earlier point, if you see the European Union as a kind of new political system, it is not unusual that there's disagreement and contestation up to a point, as would occur within any domestic system of politics. Macron has recently changed his view on accession of new countries. Of course, this refers specifically to countries on the Western Balkans, which have had an accession perspective for a long time, and which went already through quite considerable adaptations and changes and preparations to become one day full members of the European Union. You should not forget that the idea in principle is that at least some of the new member states, and here I refer also to the countries that have entered, say in 2004, 2005, will gradually, over time, also become net contributors. I mean, the basic argument would be that obviously you can build a European economy that is prosperous, successful, and that would also mean that some of the member states which are currently net recipients one day will also become net contributors. I really have to highlight that the conflict is exaggerated because in principle, there's a basic understanding that each member state will make a budget contribution on the basis of their gross national income.
Yeah.
And so that is a good reflection of the relative economic power of each country, and that forms the basis and the baseline and a sort of a basis for the calculations that could be considered as fair under the given circumstances. So for that reason, I think, conflict to the degree that is to be expected in any political system about budgetary
I'm going to interrupt you, Gunter, just because we're quickly. I do apologize. I just want to give you under a minute, if you can, Justin, just your final thoughts. Do you think that the European Union should be taking on any new members? Like, as you both have alluded to, it seems the bloc is just taking on too much. Should it just slow down a bit?
Yeah, I agree with your speaker, Gunter. I mean, when you think about candidate countries, Albania, Montenegro, Serbia, and as you mentioned, North Macedonia as well. Initially, at least, there will obviously be the kind of fear that they will be net recipients rather than kind of like providers to the European Union. It's only after a while that countries perhaps that are more developing in the bloc actually kind of make more of a kind of formal contribution. So in terms of enlargement, I don't think some of the discussions and the disagreements at the EU meeting are necessarily reflective of that. But I think it will certainly kind of make people rather more hesitant, make leaders hesitant for supporting some of the kind of new candidates coming in. I just think it's perhaps a period of reflection, and of course Britain has to kind of negotiate with the European Union up until kind of the end of this year. So I think they will kind of prefer to sort out some of the initial issues in relation to that impact before they accept new member states.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final thought, but we appreciate both Justin and Gunter for their time and, of course, for putting this all into context for us. Now, viewers, throughout the segment, we've tried to give you, the context of what exactly happened at this EU budget meeting. It doesn't seem like it's as big a deal possibly as it may seem on the outside. Sure, Brexiteers probably at this point in time are feeling pretty good about themselves because they're feeling like, okay, there's this $81 billion hole right now in the EU budget with the EU seemingly is struggling to try to fill. However, it will probably fill that because even the last budget meeting that occurred, that it took 2 rounds for that budget to be decided upon. And that time, the UK was still very much a member of the European Union. So maybe this isn't as big a deal as it seems. However, of course, the optics are not good. So as far as scoring political points, this is probably something good to point out. Nevertheless, it seems, though, that the EU is taking on too much. It's trying to do too much all in one go. Fight climate change, modernize digitally, fight youth unemployment, as well as also possibly to lift up its poorer member states, as I keep mentioning, Hungary, Romania, and others, who are also at some levels quite critical of the EU, especially Hungary and Viktor Orban. So is this a good time for new member states to be added on as members to this bloc? Or should the EU simply be slowing down? And we weren't able to talk about the foreign policy and the foreign angle and all this. And of course, the migration issue as well, which continues to add financial pressure as well upon the European Union as a bloc. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.